3:07 a.m., the Western Pacific. 3 separate positions. USS Gerald R. Ford holds station 410 kilometers east of the Ryukyu Islands. USS Carl Vinson is 290 kilometers northeast of Luzon, in the Philippine Sea. USS Theodore Roosevelt is 340 kilometers south of Okinawa, her flight deck cycling the last sorties of the evening maintenance check. 3 carrier strike groups, 3 Aegis networks, 3 separate command structures operating under a single INDOPACOM operational framework. 3 separate positions chosen deliberately, distributed enough to prevent a single salvo from threatening all 3 simultaneously, concentrated enough to maintain mutual support geometry. The positioning had been calculated at INDOPACOM 14 days earlier, when the intelligence picture began showing elevated planned rocket force activity at the DF-ZF support bases in Shandong and Shanxi provinces. DF-ZF, not a ballistic missile in the conventional sense, not a cruise missile, a hypersonic glide vehicle, a weapon that rides a ballistic boost phase to altitude, then detaches and enters unpowered hypersonic glide at Mach 8 to Mach 10, capable of lateral maneuver exceeding 600 kilometers from its nominal trajectory during the glide phase. The glide vehicle does not follow a predictable ballistic arc. It follows physics and a seeker. The seeker knows where it is going. The intercept solution does not know where the vehicle will be when the interceptor arrives. This is the problem. This is why 3 carrier groups are watching it come. At 3:07 a.m., 24 DF-ZF glide vehicles launch from 6 sites, 4 in Shandong province, 2 in Shanxi. The boost phase burns for 90 seconds. The glide vehicles detach at 80 kilometers altitude and begin their lateral maneuver sequence, not flying straight at their targets, but arcing across the upper atmosphere at Mach 9.3, bleeding speed gradually as they approach their terminal phase. From the SBIRS satellite, the boost plumes are visible for 90 seconds and then gone. What replaces them on the thermal display is nothing. A hypersonic glide vehicle at 60 kilometers altitude produces negligible infrared signature compared to a boost plume. The SBIRS algorithm flags the event as Hypersonic Glide Vehicle Launch /24 confirmed boosters /terminal targeting unknown. Terminal targeting unknown. The glide vehicles have not yet committed to their final approach vectors. They are maneuvering. INDOPACOM knows 24 weapons are in the air. It does not yet know which carrier group each is targeting. This is the second problem, and it is the problem the plan designed the DF-ZF specifically to create. The plan had been developing the DF-ZF for 17 years. The program had survived 3 budget cycles, 2 leadership changes at the plan rocket force, and 1 major technical setback in 2019 when the 4th test vehicle failed to achieve the target lateral maneuver range. The failure had added 22 months to the development timeline and produced a redesigned control surface architecture that ultimately achieved 640 kilometers of lateral maneuver capability, 180 kilometers more than the original specification. The weapon that entered operational inventory in 2022 was better than the one initially designed. The US had been tracking the DF-ZF program since 2014. By 2020, INDOPACOM had a reasonably complete picture of the weapon's performance envelope: boost altitude, glide speed, maneuver capability, terminal seeker characteristics. The picture was not complete in one dimension: the terminal seeker's discrimination capability against Aegis deception signatures. The SM-3 Block 2A had been validated against the DF-17 HGV in simulation. The SM-6 in terminal ballistic missile defense mode had been validated in 2 live-fire tests against HGV representative targets. Neither test had used a target that fully replicated the DF-ZF's lateral maneuver profile during the glide phase. Tonight was the first time the Intercept solution would be tested against the real thing. The Space Force analyst at the Missile Warning Center had been specifically briefed on the DF-ZF launch signature protocol 3 weeks earlier, as part of a readiness assessment that had been ordered when the planned rocket force activity indicators at Shandong began trending upward. She was the third analyst on the overnight rotation specifically selected for her background in hypersonic vehicle tracking. When the 24 boost plumes registered at 3:07 a.m. and then went dark at 3:08 a.m., she had already begun the HGV tracking protocol. The protocol was different from standard ballistic missile tracking. Instead of projecting a ballistic arc, it maintained a probability cone around each vehicle's last known position, updated every 4 seconds from SBIRS and 2 additional imaging satellites that had been repositioned over the Western Pacific 11 days earlier as part of the INDOPACOM readiness response. The probability cones were large. A vehicle capable of 640 kilometers of lateral maneuver over a 3,000-kilometer flight profile is a vehicle that can be almost anywhere in a very large piece of sky. At 3:09 a.m., 2 minutes after launch, the first targeting discrimination became possible. 3 of the 24 glide vehicles had committed to approach vectors that resolved unambiguously toward USS Gerald R. Ford. 4 were on approach vectors consistent with USS Carl Vinson. The remaining 17 were still in maneuver profiles that could resolve toward any of the 3 carrier groups, or toward Guam, or toward Okinawa. USS Gerald R. Ford's combat system received the 3 confirmed tracks at 3:09 a.m. and began computing SM-3 Block 2A engagement solutions. The SM-3 Block 2A was designed for ballistic missile intercept. Its kinetic interceptor guides on a projected intercept point computed from the target's trajectory at time of engagement. Against a glide vehicle that can maneuver 640 kilometers, the projected intercept point is valid only if the vehicle does not maneuver after the SM-3 launches. The SM-3 cannot correct its course mid-flight to account for post-launch maneuver. The engagement solution therefore required a timing judgment. Launch the SM-3 early enough to reach the intercept altitude before the glide vehicle begins its terminal phase, when maneuver authority decreases as the vehicle decelerates, but not so early that the vehicle has time to maneuver away from the projected intercept point. The window was 11 seconds. The combat system computed it in 1.4 seconds. 3 SM-3 Block 2EA launched from USS Gerald R. Ford at 3:14 a.m. 1 per confirmed track, targeting the predicted intercept points at 34, 38, and 41 kilometers altitude above the target's projected approach corridor. The first DF-ZF continued on its approach vector. The SM-3 kinetic interceptor reached the predicted intercept point at 3:19 a.m. The glide vehicle was there. Intercept confirmed. Intercept assessment, high confidence. The second DF-ZF maneuvered. At 3:17 a.m., 2 minutes after the SM-3 launched, the glide vehicle executed a 47-kilometer lateral shift to its right, exiting the SM-3's projected intercept corridor. The SM-3 passed 34 kilometers clear. The glide vehicle was now at 31 kilometers altitude, decelerating, entering its terminal phase. Maneuver authority was decreasing. It was committed. THAAD on Guam, 1,100 kilometers from USS Gerald R. Ford's position, had the track. The THAAD engagement solution was computed in 2 seconds. THAAD launched at 3:18 a.m. The glide vehicle was at 29 kilometers altitude and Mach 6.4 BSOT, decelerating but still hypersonic. The THAAD kinetic interceptor reached 28 kilometers altitude at 3:19 a.m. Impact. The glide vehicle ceased to exist as a coherent structure at 28 kilometers altitude, 340 kilometers from USS Gerald R. Ford. The third DF-ZF did not maneuver. It continued on its original approach vector, either because its guidance system had not commanded a maneuver, or because it had been allocated a terminal approach that did not require one. The SM-3 assigned to it reached the intercept point at 3:19 a.m. The vehicle was not there. The SM-3 passed through empty sky. The glide vehicle had not maneuvered. It had simply been on a slightly different trajectory than the combat system's targeting solution had projected. The difference, 2.3 kilometers. The SM-3 missed by 2.3 kilometers. USS Gerald R. Ford's SM-6 batteries engaged in terminal ballistic missile defense mode at 3:20 a.m. The third DF-ZF was at 22 kilometers altitude and Mach 5.1, decelerating. The SM-6 engagement solution was based on the vehicle's current observed trajectory, not a projected ballistic arc, but a 3-second radar track extrapolation, updated every 0.4 seconds. The SM-6 is not designed for this. It was doing it anyway. Impact at 3:20 a.m., 19 kilometers altitude. The detonation proximity was close enough to structurally compromise the glide vehicle's control surfaces. The vehicle lost guidance. It impacted the ocean 47 kilometers from USS Gerald R. Ford. 47 kilometers. Not close enough to damage the carrier. Close enough to know the engagement had not been comfortable. This was the plan's best result of the night. A DF-ZF that defeated an SM-3 intercept through trajectory deviation, not active maneuver but precision, and was then stopped by an SM-6 performing an engagement it was not specifically designed for. The SM-6 team would spend 4 months after this engagement writing the post-action report. The report would include the phrase, "engagement at the edge of the weapon's validated performance envelope." That phrase would drive the next SM-6 upgrade cycle. USS Carl Vinson's 4 confirmed approach tracks were engaged at 3:13 a.m., 1 minute before the Gerald R. Ford engagements began, because the Carl Vinson tracks had committed to approach vectors slightly earlier in the glide phase. 4 SM-3 Block 2A from USS Carl Vinson and USS Bunker Hill. 3 intercepts in the standard engagement window. 1 SM-3 miss. The target vehicle had maneuvered 31 kilometers laterally between the SM-3's launch and its arrival at the projected intercept point. THAAD from Guam engaged the maneuvering vehicle at 3:18 a.m. The glide vehicle was at Mach 6.8 and 33 kilometers altitude when the THAAD kinetic vehicle impacted. Intercept confirmed. 4 tracks on USS Carl Vinson. 4 intercepts. 0 reach terminal phase within the carrier's defensive perimeter. The remaining 17 glide vehicles had not yet committed. At 3:12 a.m., 5 minutes after launch, 4 more resolved toward USS Theodore Roosevelt. 3 toward Guam. 10 remained in maneuver profiles that were not yet discriminated. The 10 undiscriminated vehicles were the plan's operational architecture at work. By holding 10 vehicles in extended maneuver profiles, the targeting picture for Indo-PACOM remained uncertain for 7 minutes after launch. 7 minutes in which THAAD and the 3 carrier groups could not commit their full intercept capacity because they did not know what they were committing against. The discrimination problem was not an accident. It was a design feature. At 3:14 a.m., 3 of the 10 undiscriminated vehicles committed simultaneously to approach vectors toward USS Theodore Roosevelt, creating a 6-track problem for a single carrier group. The remaining 7 committed to approach vectors toward Guam at 3:15 a.m. USS. Theodore Roosevelt's combat system processed the 6-track problem in 1.8 seconds and allocated SM-3 launch assignments across USS Theodore Roosevelt, USS Bunker Hill, and USS Leyte Gulf. 6 SM-3 launched between 3:14 and 3:16 a.m. 4 intercepts. 2 misses. Both vehicles had maneuvered after SM-3 launch. The first miss was engaged by THAAD from Okinawa, a repositioned battery that had been moved from its standard position to a southeastern firing sector 11 days earlier, specifically to cover the USS Theodore Roosevelt's operating area during the elevated threat period. The THAAD engagement at 3:19 a.m. Glide vehicle at 31 kilometers altitude, Mach 7.1. Intercept confirmed. The second miss had executed a maneuver that placed it outside both the THAAD Okinawa engagement envelope and the SM-6 terminal engagement envelope from USS Theodore Roosevelt. It was at 24 kilometers altitude, Mach 5.8. and still descending when USS Leyte Gulf fired two SM-6 in salvo mode. The first on the vehicle's current projected approach, the second on a displaced intercept geometry 8 kilometers to the vehicle's right, accounting for a possible final maneuver. The vehicle maneuvered right into the second SM-6, impact at 3:21 a.m., 21 kilometers altitude. This was USS Theodore Roosevelt's closest engagement of the night. A glide vehicle that defeated an SM-3 outmaneuvered THAAD's engagement geometry and was stopped by a second SM-6 on a probabilistic displaced intercept, the salvo mode, firing two SM-6 to cover two probable approach paths, was not in the standard engagement protocol. The weapons officer on USS Leyte Gulf who authorized the salvo had been running a mental calculation for 30 seconds. The vehicle had maneuvered right on every previous engagement in the night's picture. She authorized the right displaced intercept. She was correct. The 7 glide vehicles targeting Guam reached THAAD engagement range at 3:17 a.m. The THAAD battery on Guam had been at maximum readiness since 3:07 a.m. 7 tracks, 7 intercepts computed. 6 SM, 3 Block 2A from USS Bunker Hill, added to the engagement picture to provide layered coverage. Of 7 vehicles, 5 intercepted by THAAD in the standard engagement window. 2 defeated THAAD intercepts through maneuver. Both were engaged by SM-6 from USS Bunker Hill at terminal phase. 1 confirmed intercept. 1 vehicle impacted the northern end of Andersen Air Force Base's runway extension, outside the base's hardened perimeter. The runway extension was non-operational. No personnel in the impact area. No aircraft on the runway extension. 1 DF-ZF reached its target. Of 24 launched, 23 intercepted or deflected. 1 impacted Andersen's runway extension. Non-critical infrastructure, no injuries. The 23 intercepts had required SM-3 Block 2A from 3 carriers and 2 surface combatants, THAAD from Guam and Okinawa, and SM-6 terminal engagement from 4 Aegis ships. The combined intercept architecture had performed at the edge of its validated envelope against a weapon system it had never engaged in combat. It had performed. At 3:22 a.m., 15 minutes after the DF-ZF launch, the plan offensive element fell silent. No second salvo registered on SBIRS. The Eastern Theater Command's operational plan had allocated 24 glide vehicles to the opening strike. The reserve, 12 additional vehicles, required a 4-hour reload cycle at the launch sites. The reload cycle was already underway, but the 4 hours required for reload was 4 hours in which the U.S. response would be executing. Operation Night Answer activated at 3:08 a.m., 1 minute after the DF-ZF launches, while the glide vehicles were still in boost phase. The planned rocket force's DF-ZF support infrastructure, the 6 launch sites, the vehicle assembly facilities, the transportation network connecting them, and the command nodes coordinating the operation, had been in the Indopacom target database for 22 months. The targeting package had been updated by satellite imagery 48 hours earlier. 4 B-2 Spirit bombers, airborne from Diego Garcia since 11:14 p.m. as part of a pre-positioned readiness response to the planned rocket force activity indicators, received their strike packages at 3:09 a.m. 96 J ASSMER 114 Tomahawk, Block 5 from USS Carl Vinson surface screen, USS Gerald R. Ford surface screen, and USS Theodore Roosevelt surface screen. 3 separate Tomahawk packages launched simultaneously at 3:12 a.m. 61F/A, 18F and F-35C sorties off 3 carrier decks beginning at 3:10 a.m. At Minute 14, 284 aim points allocated across 161 separate planned rocket force installations. The 6 launch sites, vehicle storage and maintenance facilities, propulsion test infrastructure, command nodes, and the transportation nodes connecting the DF-ZF support base at Heze in Shandong to its forward dispersal sites. By 3:24 a.m., 17 minutes after the DF-ZF launch, The United States had authorized $2.1 billion in precision munitions against the infrastructure that had launched 24 hypersonic glide vehicles at 3 carrier groups and an air base. 96 JASSM-ER at $1.36 million, $130.6 million, 114 Tomahawks at $2.09 million, $238.3 million. The F/A-18F and F-35C JDAM and JSOW packages were still computing. The invoice was still building. The Heze DF-ZF assembly and storage facility, the largest DF-ZF infrastructure node in Shandong province, assessed as capable of supporting 12 vehicles simultaneously, received 4 JASSM-ER at 4:11 a.m. The facility had been hardened against conventional munitions. It had not been hardened against the GBU-28 hard target penetrators carried by 2 of the 4 B-2s, released at 4:07 a.m. from 52,000 feet. First penetrator reached its detonation depth at 4:11 a.m. Seismographs at the CTBTO station in Jinan registered a 2.6 magnitude event at 4:11 a.m. Second penetrator, 3.1 magnitude at 4:11 a.m. The reload cycle for the 6 DF-ZF launch sites had been underway since 3:22 a.m. By 4:11 a.m., it had been running for 49 minutes. The facility at Heze that supported the reload of 4 of the 6 sites was non-operational at 4:11 a.m. The 4 sites it supported would not complete their reload cycle. Of 29 planned Rocket Force DF-ZF support installations targeted, 21 assessed as non-operational or severely degraded by 4:47 a.m. 8 assessed as partially functional, requiring reassessment. The plan's 4-hour reload cycle for a second salvo was no longer viable at 4 of 6 launch sites. The remaining 2 sites, in Shaanxi province, outside the immediate Tomahawk range window and requiring B-2 JASSM-ER engagement, were assessed as having partial reload capability. Second wave capacity, a maximum of 8 glide vehicles, if the 2 Shaanxi sites completed their cycles without further engagement. The B-2S were still airborne. The Shaanxi sites were in their targeting packages. At 4:51 a.m., the Indopacom assessment officer updated the DF-ZF operational database. 24 glide vehicles launched, 23 intercepted or deflected. 1 impacted Anderson's runway extension, non-critical, no injuries. 21 of 29 support installations, non-operational. Second salvo capacity, severely degraded. The first combat employment of the DF-ZF hypersonic glide vehicle had produced 1 runway extension impact and 23 intercepts. The intercept architecture had required every layer simultaneously, SM-3, THAAD, SM-6, and had operated at the edge of its validated performance envelope on 4 separate engagements. It had held. The 4 months of post-action analysis that followed would produce 14 upgrade recommendations across the SM-3, SM-6, and THAAD programs. The most consequential, the SM-6 displaced salvo mode, 2 rounds on offset intercept geometries to account for terminal maneuver, would be formally incorporated into the standard engagement protocol for hypersonic glide vehicle targets within 60 days. The weapons officer on USS Leyte Gulf, who had made that call at 3:20 a.m., would not know about the protocol change until the formal notification arrived. She would read it at her desk during the morning brief. She would note that the displaced geometry she had chosen had been 8 kilometers right. The protocol would specify 8 to 12 kilometers depending on vehicle speed and altitude at engagement initiation. She had been at 8. She had been in the window. The runway extension at Anderson would be repaired in 11 days. The DF-ZF support infrastructure at Heze would not be repaired in 11 days. The gap between those 2 timelines was the operational accounting of what had happened between 3:07 a.m. and 4:51 a.m. over the Western Pacific. The machine had held, and then it had answered.